Hello, welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather. I make videos about left politics, and they're mostly about the UK, and they're mostly about the shameless weaponisation of anti-Semitism to purge left from the Labour Party and from the broader public realm. And this is a little bit of a different one for me, because the starting point for this is the accusation that's come up since last week that anti-Semitism is being weaponised against the right. And this came up with accusations that the first ever UK National Conservatism Conference had used anti-Semitic tropes, had downplayed the Holocaust. So Yoram Hazony, who is a Israeli-American philosopher and is one of the main people behind this conference, he said, "There is no anti-Semitism here. We are simply looking at unscrupulous leftist operatives who are willing to falsely accuse innocent men and women in order to drive conservative men and women out of politics." That was an interview in the Jewish Chronicle, so good to see them platforming the far right, really. Also, in the Jewish Chronicle, Gary Mont, who thinks the border deputies is way too left-wing and should not be concerning themselves with social justice, as that has nothing to do with Judaism. He also came out and said it's ridiculous that they're calling this conference anti-Semitic because of terms like cultural Marxism, because that's like hard, that's got some associations, but it's mostly not anti-Semitic, and it's ludicrous to suggest that it is. He says, these attacks on conservative-minded politicians, who are often philo-Semitic and strong supporters of Israel, take attention away from real Jew hatred. He lists some examples of real Jew hatred, which include the denial of Israel's right to exist and to defend itself. Quite a telling example there. In conclusion, he says, the weaponisation of anti-Semitism, as has happened in this dispute, what in my view are political aims unrelated to Jew hatred, must stop. If it does not, we risk diluting our defences against much more serious assaults on Jews, Judaism and Israel. I think, given the shameless weaponisation of anti-Semitism to shut down the left, to shut down the Palestine Solidarity Movement, to shut down Palestinians wanting to speak about their own oppression, this is what I would call chutzpah. Chutzpah is a Yiddish word which is sort of like cheeky, but way more extreme than that. So my favourite definition of this is from I heard it from my dad, but it's much more common than that, which is chutzpah is when a kid murders both his parents and then throws himself on the mercy of the court because he's an orphan. Right, so what I want to do is to look at what's been labelled anti-Semitism within the National Conservatism Conference in the UK, to, along the way, do some comparisons with how allegations of left-wing anti-Semitism are discussed and dealt with. But mostly what I want to do is to take apart the terrible approach we have to saying whether something is or is not anti-Semitic, which is like to obsess about anti-Semitic tropes and to reduce everything to that, take things out of context. I kind of want to say it's a tropification or the tropification of anti-Semitism, and to suggest a different approach to thinking about all forms of racism, a more contextualised approach. So again, this video pushes into, as some of them do, areas that I don't really feel very confident speaking about, but I'm doing it because I don't see this being discussed anywhere else, and I really want to thank people who, when I've said I'm not very confident about this on other videos, have been super supportive in the comments, really encouraging, and also have sometimes put some really detailed responses which have helped me to think more deeply about what's going on and work out what I feel about it. Okay, so let's start. Let's start with Douglas Murray. So Douglas Murray, who is, I guess, a bit of a global superstar in this national conservatism movement. He was the speaker at their flashy dinner, which they had at the Natural History Museum. nice to see the Natural History Museum selling out to the far right. So he talked about nationalism, as you'd expect. Everyone kind of talks about nationalism at this bloody conference. And he said that nationalism looks different in different countries, and there was never anything wrong with nationalism in Britain, but there was something wrong with nationalism in Germany. And he says, I don't see why no one should be allowed to love their country because the Germans mucked up twice in a century. So I think we can imagine what would happen if anyone on the left said this, but of course nobody on the left would do that because we would not make a joke of or downplay the Holocaust in that way. We can see the hypocrisy when Jeremy Corbyn mispronounced the surname of Jewish sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. All hell broke loose. But at this time, there was a lot of excuses made for him. So people talked about how he's using the term mucked up as a kind of classic understatement, so he wasn't downplaying anything. I don't want to get into whether this is or is not Holocaust distortion or downplaying. I don't think that's important for noticing the hypocrisy in the ways in which left and right anti-Semitism are treated. And I made a big thing about this in a video I did about the way in which Nazi comparisons are used in UK politics and the way in which the left is seen as fair game, and you can compare us to like Nazis, Hitler, 1930s Germany as much as you want, and there's very little, if any, pushback about that. But when you do it against an actual far-right government, like our government at the moment, who are doing super racist immigration policies, well, then, you shouldn't be invoking the Holocaust. And I think what's also crucial to note here is that people like Douglas Murray, ditto Suella Braverman, who has been accused in the past of anti-Semitism, they're seen as redeemable because of the way in which they align with the anti-Semitism movement. So Douglas Murray has appeared on a platform for the campaign against anti-Semitism. Suella Braverman has talked about how much she values David Baddiel's book, Jews Don't Count, and how significant that is for her, and has, gone and, increased the funding to the Community Security Trust, increased the government support for that organisation. So the way in which the kind of far-right discourse around anti-Semitism and opposition to anti-Semitism then becomes a way of excusing the actions of people like Murray and Braverman. Okay, but I want to leave that one. I want to move on. David Starkey says some fucked up stuff as well, as you'd expect. Something along the lines of, we on the left are jealous of Jewish people because we want to replace the Holocaust with slavery. Okay. But the thing which really I want to focus on, and the main accusation of anti-Semitism from the left and the liberal centre to the right, and the one which they've mostly had to defend, has been the use of the term cultural Marxism. So this term has been called an antisemitic trope. So let's begin by looking at that claim, and then I want to look at the problem with the trope approach to anti-Semitism, and then to look at a different approach to understanding whether national conservatism is anti-Semitic or not. So this dates back to quite a while. We can certainly see it in the 1990s in the US, and cultural Marxism refers in that context to something called the Frankfurt School. So this is a group of thinkers, philosophers, researchers, cultural theorists, I guess. And they are mostly Jewish, or were mostly Jewish. They're mostly dead now. And they were around in Germany until 1930s. Then this institute moved to the US to escape Nazism, and then they moved back to Germany, to Frankfurt in the 1950s. And it refers to a kind of Bill Berkowitz writing in 2003. I'll put a link to this and to everything else that I used and referenced in this video in the description box below. Sorry, I'm really incoherent today. It's because I've got a bit of a cold, so my voice is really wrecked, but I really want to make this video while it's still current, and also because I said I'd do 2 videos a month, and you know, the end of May is just one bank holiday away, isn't it? Just a few days away. So here we go. So Bill Berkowitz, writing in 2003, he talks about this cultural Marxism as the idea that this Frankfurt School planned to try to convince mainstream Americans that white ethnic pride is bad, that sexual liberation is good, and that supposedly traditional American values, so that's Christianity, family values, and so on, are reactionary and bigoted. So, with their core values thus subverted, the theory goes, Americans will be quick to sign up to the ideas of the far left. And in this article, Bill also tracks the way in which those who are promoting this conspiratorial theory align it not just to the Frankfurt School, but to more contemporary Jewish activists and academics. So that's not its only reference point. Before this, the Nazis talked about cultural Bolshevism and Judeo-Bolshevism, so this kind of conflation of left wing with Jewish people, with a kind of, I guess, a fifth column of people who are out to subvert Western values, to subvert good German values, and trying to take over, to threaten the end of civilization, I guess. And there are other modern variants. So Jordan Peterson talks about postmodern Marxism. He would say, again, of course, that this is not anti-Semitic, but Dan, who has a YouTube channel, 3 Arrows, looks through this and looks at the way in which many people who are anti-Semitic are attracted to this theory, and he does a really good job of analysing the connections to cultural Bolshevism. So I guess, given its history, we can call it an anti-Semitic trope, cultural Marxism, in the sense that it's a theme or a motif that recurs in anti-Semitic movements, multiple anti-Semitic movements. Okay, but we are obviously painfully aware that there are massive problems with taking a trope approach to anti-Semitism. So Tony Lerman writes about this in his book, Whatever Happened to Antisemitism, and he talks about tropes being wielded like sledgehammers against the left, against our ideas and our right to speak, and of course against the Palestine Solidarity Movement and to support apartheid. So what happens with this wielding like sledgehammers is that words and images are ripped from their context, and we render anti-Semitism a matter of, is it or isn't it? Are they or aren't they? No ambiguity. So a very recent example is Stephen Pollard, who used to be the editor in the Jewish Chronicle. He now writes for them occasionally. I guess he's got some honorary position. I don't know. So he was writing about an article in The Guardian, where The Guardian was reporting on the different access to water that Palestinians who are in the West Bank territories occupied by Israel get compared to their neighbours just down the road in settlements who are Jewish Israelis. And Stephen Pollard's very angry about this. He says it leaves out crucial information. I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to go into the fact that he accuses it of being an anti-Semitic trope. What anti-Semitic trope could this be? Well, the issue of Israel, I'm quoting from him now, the issue of Israel's supposed starving of the water supply to Palestinians is a sort of modern blood libel. This time it's not Jews drinking the blood of Gentiles, which is the centuries ago European Christian idea that Jews stole Christian children, consumed their blood. But in a neat twist, going back to Stephen Pollard, this is Jews refusing to allow anyone who isn't a Jew to drink. Now, we've seen a lot of use and abuse of this trope of blood libel. If you do a cartoon that is a political satirical cartoon that's attacking some of the things Israel does to Palestinians, and you put blood in it, blood libel. If you talk about Israel killing children in Gaza, blood libel, children, blood. I've never seen this drinking one before. This is like overreach on top of overreach on top of overreach, right? So it's really... Okay, so how can we look at the problems with this? So one thing that we can do is we can say children don't simply exist as a trope within some tenuous connection to a many centuries ago Christian anti-Semitic, violent anti-Semitic story about Jews. Children also exist within wider culture as a trope. So, for example, within charities and NGOs and human rights discourse. A charity will often put a child on the front of a leaflet or an advert to try to get people to donate. And they'll do that because we have ideas in society about the innocence of children and their vulnerability. So to remove that from Palestinian advocacy because of this old European Christian lies and violence about Jews is to render the fight against anti-Semitism a tool for oppression. And the same goes for water, the idea of water as life. We cannot take that away and say that somehow references to drinking water are somehow always and only about, when they're referencing Israel, when they're referencing Jews directly or indirectly, are only and always about blood libel. And they are just anti-Semitism. There is nothing else to say about them. Tony Lerman, in his book, deals with lots of other examples, and I'll just cite one, which is Mark Wadsworth. He is a long-time anti-racist activist who was active in the Black Sections movement in the Labour Party many decades ago, which resulted in the first Black Labour MPs, the first Black MPs being elected. And he went to the launch of a report by the Labour Party on anti-Semitism, Islamophobia and racism, and he chose to contribute to the discussion and to point out the lack of Black people in the room. But before he did that, he referred to an MP who he'd seen being handed a press release by a Telegraph journalist, so a very right-wing newspaper. And he talked about them working hand in hand. And this subsequently became a famous example of anti-Semitic trope on the grounds that it played into ideas of Jews controlling the media. Now, Tony Lerman, writing about this, says that this accusation completely drains the term, trope, of anything to do with anti-Semitism, in effect making the mere mention of the word Jew and journalist in the same sentence automatically partaking of a trope, even in this case where Jews aren't mentioned, but there is a Jewish person indirectly referenced, even when Mark Wadsworth, and there's no reason not to believe him on this, didn't know Ruth Smith was Jewish. I mean, who even knew back in like 2016 who Ruth Smith was? We kind of know now from the Labour Party on the left, but I didn't know who she was. Tony goes on, if a trope is to have any real anti-Semitic character, it must consist of more than just a close juxtaposition of two words. We cannot view tropes as fixed and eternal, and we cannot strip out context. Stripping out context is really good for the right. It makes it super easy to attack us, as we can see in the Mark Wadsworth example. It also makes it super easy to hide the agenda, which we can see in the Stephen Pollard example. Because what they want to say is, like, it's not a problem to criticise Israel, it's just that you mention blood, you mention children, you mention drinking. Like, no. What they're trying to do is they're trying to make all criticism of Israel de facto anti-Semitic. I guess with the exception of, wouldn't it be nice if we went back to the version of apartheid and ethnic cleansing that Israel had before the current government? Because the current government, we don't like them. So maybe that's allowed, but nothing else. Okay, so let's go back to cultural Marxism and to think about the trope idea. So again, I don't think we should strip out context. I don't think we should try to say that cultural Marxism always has the same meaning. So I put on Twitter that I was thinking about doing this video. I asked for suggestions for things to read. Super grateful for those. I will put the Twitter IDs of people who helped me out in the description box to say thank you. And one suggestion was that I look at the work of Gabriel Rockhill, and he is a researcher, and he talks about the Frankfurt School as cultural Marxist. And he does that because he wants to identify a form of anti-capitalism which is also opposed to socialism, and a way of engaging with Marxism that marked a kind of shift away from material analysis towards kind of cultural analysis. And he thinks that's important because he thinks that produced a form of anti-capitalism which was the most acceptable to the ruling class. So it got funding from corporations. A lot of the theorists, they worked for the forerunner of the CIA, the OSS during the Second World War, and actually had some links with a CIA front organization afterwards. So we can see how it was a form of anti-capitalism which the ruling class were willing to support because it was also opposed to socialism. So I don't think when Gabriel Rockhill says this is cultural Marxism that this is in any way anti-Semitic. But I don't really want to stop there. I think context matters, and I think it matters because, again, stripping out context is really good for the right, and we can see that in the way the Conservative Party has responded to multiple criticism over the years of people who use the term cultural Marxism in their party. And they say, it's not always anti-Semitic, but, it is kind of linked up to the alt-right, so we think you should just use another term. Right, this is the problem. Those other terms then become, because they're not anti-Semitic tropes, they then become unproblematic, even though they're doing the same work. So in an article called Anatomy of the British War on Woke by Hugh Davis and Sheena McRae, they analyse the way in which a lot of terms are used interchangeably. Cultural Marxism is one of them, but also you have critical race theory, CRT, references to Brexit and those people who are left behind, political correctness, but above all, woke. And woke does seem to be the term of choice for the far right at the moment. So Ron DeSantis, who's governor of Florida, and it looks like he's about to launch his bid for the Republican nomination for presidency. He has just launched a Stop Woke bill in his state, which is attempting to control what people learn, what knowledge they have access to, and also what books they have access to. Nice to see the right wing standing up for free speech and standing against cancel culture. Elon Musk talks about the woke mind virus. Okay, so these terms can be interchanged with cultural Marxism, and then you escape the trope, but you don't escape the context. And this is why we have to look at context, because none of those terms substantively change what is happening in the talk about national conservatism. So let's go to the actual speech where this comes up, where cultural Marxism appears. And it's by Miriam Cates, who is a Tory MP. I hadn't heard of her either. So she uses a lot of different terms for, the people who are opposed to national conservatism in her talk. She talks about liberalism, liberal elites, liberal individualism, globalism. She also says, she's talking about there being an alternative to national decline that can be found in, to quote, a common sense conservatism that is rooted in the values and hopes of ordinary British people and not the Westminster or global elites. I mean, it's so fucked up, isn't it, that she's from the Westminster elite and she's suggesting that she stands outside of that. But anyway, let's go to her use of cultural Marxism. And that's in relation to her main focus in the talk, which is about babies. And the lack of babies being born in the UK, the falling birth rates. Apparently, I think I can't remember, 1.6 children on average that women have now. So she says, having a home and a secure job and support from your family, community, and nation are not the only preconditions to starting a family. You must also have hope for the future. And that hope is sadly diminishing in so many of our young people today because liberal individualism has proven to be completely powerless to resist the cultural Marxism that is systematically destroying our children's souls. When culture, schools, and universities openly teach that our country is racist, our heroes are villains, humanity is killing the earth, you are what you desire, diversity is theology, boundaries are tyranny, and self-restraint is oppression, is it any wonder that mental health conditions, self-harm, suicide, and epidemic levels of anxiety and confusion characterise the emerging generation? She gets a big round of applause at that point. As that dies down, she continues, if we do not teach our children to value, to be proud of our nation and its history, is it any surprise that they do not want to be responsible for continuing it? So I think she could quite easily say that liberal individualism has proven to be completely powerless to resist the woke mind virus that's systematically destroying our children's souls, and pretty much nothing changes. And she wouldn't get accused of antisemitism because all we look for is those two words, right? That trope. We ring the bell, it triggers. So I want to say that this is a really fucked up way of looking at anti-Semitism, and it's not about whether she says this trope or not. It's not about whether she as an individual is anti-Semitic. There's quite a lot of Jewish people involved in this national conservative movement. It's getting a lot of support from the Jewish Chronicle. Like I say, it's got Yoram Hazony heading it up. It's really about what nationalism does. It's not about their individual intentions. It's about the ideas that are circulating through this movement. And nationalism has often been associated with violent anti-Semitism. And that's because Jews have links within their community as well as to the wider society. And because Jews are seen to kind of embody the idea of the rootless cosmopolitan who doesn't belong in any particular nation, they figure as an element which disturbs and disrupts the body politic, and as a kind of internal enemy. And I think the Know Your Enemy podcast, which is a US podcast which follows the far right, does a very good job of talking about this in relation to the first two national conservatism conferences that have been in the United States. And so I think it's worth, if you're interested in that understanding, it's worth looking those up. I want to say that, yeah, that's definitely an element, but I think that figure of the person who is an internal enemy within threat to the nation isn't so much in national conservatism occupied by Jews, but by Muslims. There's a real attempt to create an idea of a Judeo-Christian tradition as the West. Whereas in fact, of course, like Judaism came first, then you have Christianity building on that, creating a New Testament in their own terms, and then Islam developing on top of that, taking the old prophets from Judaism and Christianity, and then again creating a new faith with new prophets, new texts. And so the Western tradition is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And there's an attempt to extract Islam and present that as non-Western that runs across our culture now. I've been thinking about it a lot since I listened to a New York Times podcast last year, which is about the Trojan Horse Affair. And this goes back a way to accusations that Muslims were attempting to take over schools in Birmingham and to Islamize them. And it was used to create ideas about Muslims as extremists, as terrorists. and to destroy the lives of lots of Muslim teachers, Muslim governors, people who were attempting to turn and had succeeded in turning schools around. And this podcast was going back to that and was challenging that narrative. And both in the podcast and in some of the things written about it, there's an analogy drawn with the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And that's because the protocols of the Elders of Zion is supposed to be the minutes of a meeting of Jews to take over the world, control the world. It's like it gives the illusion of a found document. It's incomplete. It's like someone's found something they shouldn't have done, something that's secret and hidden. And the Trojan Horse letter has that thing. And Raf at the time on Media Diversified wrote the Trojan Horse letter circulating in Birmingham and the Halls of Power in London with nothing short of protocols of Elders of Zion level paranoia. Because this again was a letter which was incomplete, that was supposed to have been discovered by accident, revealing a secret plot by Muslims to take over the school. You don't have the first page, you don't have the last page, so you don't know who it's to and who it's from. And it's clearly, like protocols of Elders of Zion, fake. But then a lot of stuff was done with it to say, well, maybe that's fake, but actually it's kind of true. And the podcast led to people getting very concerned that we wouldn't think Muslims are trying to take over schools and turn them into like terrorist cells, right? So Michael Gove's think tank, the Policy Exchange, they produced a report to counter the podcast. It says that the notion that the events in Birmingham had nothing to do with extremism is as dangerous as it's false, since it conceals an ugly truth that too many people prefer not to acknowledge. This is actually Michael Gove's intro. What he says that ugly truth is that we have a problem in Britain with Islamist ideology and its adherents, who seek to impose their intolerant values on Muslim communities, including children, through non-violent means, including the capture of important institutions such as schools. It's kind of creepy the way he makes non-violence sound really, really violent. So they're attempting in this report to link it to a kind of broader Islamism. And they talk about connections with the left. It's not quite the same as with the kind of cultural Judeo-Bolshevism thing of the Nazis, but it's similar. So the report says that of all the relationships that Islamist organisations have nurtured in Western liberal democracies, it is perhaps that with sections of the far left which give the best rate of return for what can only be described as a minimal investment. The revolutionary left in particular asks few, if any, hard questions of Islamist actors, whilst appearing happy to replicate arguments about Islamophobia. So it says, I guess, that people like me are happy to make the kind of arguments I'm making here, which is that Trojan Horse, seriously Islamophobic, national conservatism, seriously Islamophobic. And like I say, this report is attempting to connect to a much bigger global movement, which it refers to as the Islamization of Knowledge Project, and it wants Muslim students, it claims it wants Muslim students to be able to distinguish themselves from others and feel proud of this distinction and be anxious to preserve it, thus becoming self-conscious of their true identity. I mean, like, is it weird that Jewish people want their children to, feel proud of the distinction, feel proud of being Jewish? Is it weird that parents of any religion, Christian parents, want that for their children? Why is it so sinister and part of some big plot if Muslims do that? Goes on to explain that, I guess. Again, eerily echoing things which are said about Jewish people in the past and still in the present. It prioritizes Muslim collective identity above the identity of the individual. It sees individualism as a feature of secularism to be resisted. So it says it challenges a lot of Western ideas. So the idea that we acquire knowledge solely through human reasoning experience and wants to put revelation from Allah as where knowledge comes from. So it seems to me that these, like I said, that there's real parallels here, and that this kind of positioning of Muslims as the hated outsider is the animating dynamic of much of national conservatism. But, you know, like I said, this is very much at the limits of my knowledge. I'm kind of just trying to make sense of this. So if I'm wrong, please tell me if you think I'm wrong, please tell me that you think I'm wrong. Please give me stuff to read on this, and maybe I'll be able to do another video to follow it up. So, like Suella Braverman, who fronts the UK government's racist immigration policies as a woman of colour, Yoram Hazony, as a Israeli-American Orthodox Jew, he provides much of the intellectual infrastructure for the national conservatism movement globally, and is one of the powers behind expanding it into new countries like ours. He is a right-wing Zionist. He's advised Benjamin Netanyahu in the past, and he argues for national cohesion based on biblical faith. And again, he's trying to create a Judeo-Christian tradition there that is distinct from the tradition that leads into Islam. He argues against imperialist institutions, and he does that in opposition to nationalism. And he uses the United Nations and the European Union quite commonly to exemplify these kind of imperialist internationalist organizations. And he does that in part because of their criticism of Israel. And so he's opposing here kind of universalist discourses like human rights. To quote the late lamented Michael Brooks, the only place that fascism works for Jewish people is Israel. And I don't really know how to think about this, but it feels to me like what's happening in Israel is changing the way in which Jewish people relate to, and Jewishness figures within the politics of the far right. And again, that's something that I'm only just beginning to think about. And I want to end by quoting Natasha Roth-Roland. So she's a journalist with 972 magazine, which I think is one of the best news sources for me on what's happening in Israel-Palestine. And she's writing about the weaponization of anti-Semitism. So this is going back a bit. It's when Emma Watson, Hermione Granger, was criticised for expressing solidarity with Palestinians. And Natasha writes, so much of Hasbara, which is Israeli propaganda, rests on the working assumption that Palestinians are part of an international effort to subvert the free world, and that they use trickery, deceit, and media manipulation to achieve their aims. The idea of a global Islamic conspiracy is by no means an original one, but its near universal promotion by successful far-right political parties around the world is a testament to its enduring pull. So I think I'm leaving it in a weird place, but it's because I feel like this is a work in progress. This is me trying to think things through and trying to think things through with you as the people who watch my videos. And I hope it's been of some help, and thank you again for watching. Thank you for liking, thank you for commenting, thank you for sharing. Thank you for being such an amazing group of people, those of you who watch my videos and who talk to me about them. And so I'm going to say goodbye. My voice is going, right?